Shalom, shalom, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, in our beautiful, biblical, and ancestral, indivisible capital, Jerusalem, since King David's time. I am here today with a very special guest, Einat Wilf. Shalom, Einat.
Shalom.
Thank you so much for being here today. Just a little introduction. Einat is a former member of the Labor Party, Knesset member, she wrote a book, which we're going to be talking about today, called The
War of Return.
The War of Return, dealing with the war of return of the Palestinian Arabs and their right of return, and exposing the whole issue of UNRWA, the United Nations organization. Now, this is going to be an interesting conversation, because like I said to you even before we began, Einat, I was very active protesting against the Oslo process back in the early 1990s, and I was telling people then it was a disaster, and it was going to bring war and terror and push peace further away. And at the time, you were very much associated with former Prime Minister and Israeli leader, Shimon, who has done a lot. He did a lot for the state of Israel to bring it to where it was. And then that really was his baby, the new Middle East, the Oslo peace process, what I believe whitewashing terrorists to be a Palestinian authority. And you started in that direction, and today you're in a different place. Today you've exposed UNRWA and the right of return as a battle against Israel. If you'd be able to help people understand your personal, political, or not just political, but understanding and journey through these years.
Certainly. So I grew up in Jerusalem, in parentheses, experiencing the entire lie of the indivisible, annexing 32 Arab villages and calling them the indivisible capital. I lived through how it turned Jerusalem into the sad, sorry, poor city that it is today. But let's leave that aside.
Right. We have differences, and that's fine. We can still talk.
Exactly. You know, when I grew up in Jerusalem and Ehud Olmert was the mayor, people would sadly joke that he finally realized the vision of Teddy Kollek, the previous mayor, to unite Jerusalem, because under his mayorship, the western part of Jerusalem began to look like the eastern part. So, but that, in truth, that also, I'm sure, had an impact on my thinking, like the big gap between the grand talk of the undivided Jerusalem and the sorry reality. But I grew up in Beit HaKerem. The neighborhood is very much your classic secular labor Zionist environment. And I come of age, my generation serves in the military during the First Intifada.
Right.
Now, the First Intifada, now being forgotten, was actually incredibly important in the reversal of images. You'll remember it. The Palestinians were rising up, and they were using, for example, slingshots against Israeli soldiers. Well, a slingshot is clearly very emotive, so the question was, are they now the David and we're the Goliath?
Right.
They used Molotov cocktails called Bakbukei Tavera, but they were Molotov cocktails. And again, if you know your Zionist history, the Molotov cocktails, very emotive. This is in Dgania, stopping the approach of the Syrian tanks. So are they now the Dgania kibbutzniks and we're the Syrian tanks rolling in? So the First Intifada had a massive kind of impact on this changing of the imagery. The notion that they're David, we're Goliath, they are a people seeking independence, we're preventing that from them. And then all that feeds into the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, a lot of people now look at kind of the Oslo years, the new Middle East, and they say, how could you be so naive? And I'm saying, remember the 90s, to those who lived through them.
Right, I was here.
Everything that was said to be impossible happened. So the Soviet Union collapsed. The day before, everyone said it was impossible. The day after, they said it was inevitable. The countries of Eastern Europe become free. Remember the flags with the hole in them. The Berlin Wall falls down. Apartheid in South Africa comes to an end. Northern Ireland signs the Good Friday Agreement. So it was like this domino of peace and freedom. And it had a name, the end of history. So all of this, the First Intifada, coupled with all these kind of world-changing events, America remains the sole hyperpower, kind of created the notion then we can hope too. We can hope that in our little corner of the world, all the things that were thought to be impossible, intractable, were solved. And all of this...
We're solvable.
We're solvable.
Right.
Well, the other ones were solved, and this is solvable.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And all of this also was based on what was already kind of established since 1967, the idea that the path to peace is based on this equation of land for peace, right? Israel will hand over land and it will get peace. And again, at the time, it seemed to work. That was the basis for the peace agreement with Egypt. I grew up in Jerusalem, so we were brought out of our schools to wave flags at the convoy of Sadat coming to the Knesset. So all of this just worked together to make it seem utterly possible. And it was definitely worth a try. And I lived through that. I lived through this euphoria of the 90s. I can already vote. So I vote for Rabin. I vote for Paris, of course. I vote for Barak. I support the effort to make peace based on the idea of land for peace. You know, it's an era of these like handshakes, of manicured lawns, soaring speeches, no more bloodshed, no more war. So really a sense of like, we're going to, there will be a new Middle East. We could really see it, feel it, believe it. Again, remember, the whole world is transformed in a matter of a decade. I support Ehud Barak as he goes to Camp David. Camp David is already symbolic, right? This is where peace was negotiated with Egypt based on the Land for Peace formula. I see Barak put on the table a proposal that Rabin, in his worst dreams, did not imagine. Yeah. You know, in parentheses, sometimes people like to tell a story which looks like this. There was one Israeli prime minister who wanted peace. It was Rabin. He was assassinated by an Israeli right-wing extremist. And Netanyahu came to power, and that's it. There's no peace. And I'm like, this is literally the easiest thing to empirically disprove. Right. Because 5 years after the assassination of Rabin, Ehud Barak proposed to the Palestinians what Rabin, on the eve of his assassination, in a speech on the Knesset, very clearly said he would not do and did not imagine in his worst dreams. Anyway, Barak puts on the table a proposal for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, ending the occupation, no settlements, they were going to be removed or exchanged for equivalent land, capital in East Jerusalem, including in the Old City. Yep. The discussions were how to divide the Temple Mount to the Palestinians, the Muslim quarter to the Palestinians, the Jewish quarter to Israel, the Wailing Wall to Israel. I mean, that was the level of discussion. And I, with many hopeful Israelis, watch as Arafat walks away. Right. And I watch as President Clinton tries again and again, and he reframes the Barak proposal to the Clinton parameters, and Arafat walks away. And I lived through Arafat walking away. I lived through the next few years that were misnamed the Second Intifada, but they had no element of popular uprising. It was a deliberately carried out massacre. Before October 7th, you'll remember, the darkest time to live. In Israel, a real palpable sense of playing Russian roulette with your life, if you board a bus, if you go to a cafe. So I lived through that. And I also notice that there are no Palestinian voices that are criticizing Arafat walking away from this. So I begin to ask a very simple question. What do Palestinians want? What do they want? Because they clearly don't want a state. They could have had it. They didn't take it. They clearly don't care about ending the occupation. They clearly don't care about settlements, and they don't care about Jerusalem, because all of that was on the table, and they walked away. Again and again. So during this time, I meet Palestinians. I'm invited to meet Palestinian moderates. I'm considered an Israeli moderate, right? I'm the poster child of the Israeli left. I work with Shimon Peres. I worked with Yossi Beilin. I'm not yet a member of Knesset, but I already am very active in the Labor Party, supporting a two-state solution despite everything. And I'm invited to meet moderate Palestinians, those of the Palestinian Authority, the creme de la creme, educated in the best British and American universities. And I realized from talking to them, I realized from the research that became the book, The War of Return, is that they've always told us what they wanted. We just didn't listen, or when we did listen, it sounded so preposterous that we didn't really think they meant it. It's a negotiating position. But they all said various versions of from the river to the sea. And during this time, as I do the research, I come across a quote by Ernst Bevin. I've been using it ever since because it's the entire conflict in one sentence. It's from February 1947. He's the British foreign minister after World War II, as I'm sure you know, no great friend to the Jewish people. But he needs to explain why Britain failed. Not a lot of people realize that Britain was entrusted by the League of Nations unanimously with the mandate to help the Jews achieve sovereignty. It doesn't fail the Arabs. Arab states are created, the Arab mandates are fulfilled, but the Jewish mandate is not fulfilled.
Right.
So Britain betrayed a trust that it received unanimously from the League of Nations, which is why it goes back to the United Nations, the heir. And he needs to explain why Britain failed. And he says the following. He says, His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, why is this quote so great? Because it's from February 1947, and already he calls the conflict irreconcilable. We don't have settlements in February 47. We don't have an occupation. We don't have a Gaza blockade. No one has been displaced. At that moment, no one has been displaced. There's no Bibi, imagine that. No Ben Gvir, no Smotrich. So basically, all the things that we are told are the causes of the conflict, they don't exist. So there's no excuses. And already he calls it irreconcilable. And he goes on to explain. No state of Israel. No state of Israel, of course. And he goes on to explain. He says, in the land there are Jews and Arabs, so there's no question about that, and no one's called a Palestinian. And he said, and they each have a top priority. He says, for the Jews, the top priority is to establish Jewish sovereignty in the land. Great. So the Jews want to exercise the universal principle of self-determination for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. Fabulous. And then he goes on to say, and the Arabs, these are not any Arabs, these are the Arabs that will later hijack the term Palestine to be known as Palestinians. He says, for those Arabs, the top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. He's not saying, look, the Jews want to stay, the Arabs want to stay, we need some help dividing the land. He says it's a matter of top priority. The Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. By definition, irreconcilable. Now, when I tell people over the years my story, people say, oh, you've changed your opinions, or you've moved from the left to the right or something. So first I say, I'm still very much on the left. Put me on any economic, social issue, even politically, very much to the left. I said, what I did was not change an opinion. This is empirical. This is not my view. This is empirical. This is the conflict. The conflict is between the Jews wanting a state and the Arabs wanting the Jews not to have a state. I tell them, look, think of it as a scientist. We had a hypothesis. The hypothesis was what stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state. Land for peace, Palestinian independence. I'm like, okay, then comes the important part, which again, people like to gloss over. The hypothesis was tested several times. Two Israeli prime ministers, Barak and Olmert, test the hypothesis through direct negotiations, only to find Arafat and then Abu Mazen walk away, to no dissenting Palestinian voices, followed up with violence. Between them, Ariel Sharon tests the hypothesis through a unilateral disengagement We know what happened with Gaza. So the hypothesis was tested. And that's really, really important. And like good scientists, it was tested several times in a variety of ways. And it collapsed. So you ask yourself, okay, what else can explain the data? And then the Bevan hypothesis, the Jews want a state, the Arabs, the Palestinians want the Jews not to have a state, is actually a hypothesis that meets all the data. It has the best explanatory power and also the best predictive power, because from February 47, it literally predicted the behavior of the sides ever since. It predicted why the Jews would essentially always agree to a two-state solution as long as one of the two is the Jewish state, because the Jewish goal is Jewish sovereignty. It could be smaller, could be larger, but ultimately the top priority is Jewish sovereignty in the land. And the Arabs would reject every two-state solution because the goal was never a state for themselves. The goal was for the Jews not to have a state, so that they reject every two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. Right. And all I say to people, it's empirical. That's it. It's not a view.
So, but how then did you take the leap? Mm-hmm. Wait, before asking you about the leap, I just want to throw in this anecdote because you brought it up, and it gives you a little bit of where I'm coming from. And again, I'm not here to have an argument with you today. I'm here to have a conversation.
We can. It's okay.
We can as well, but I want to help educate people through the conversation more so. Letting people know that there are disagreements, that's fine.
Yeah.
But for instance, I was in the middle of my graduate degree at Columbia University during the Camp David Accords, right? And
the 2000
Camp David Accords between President Clinton and Prime Minister Barack. And all semester long, the professor, and this is graduate school, the professor's teaching us conflict resolution, international conflict resolution, different cultures. The most important thing is to have the understanding of each other's culture so that you then are able to develop a trust. Only after the understanding of culture and then the trust, then you can work on the conflict. And again, graduate school, he went to the level of detail. Do you look in the person's eyes? Do you use a fork or a spoon? Like only after that understanding of cultures, then you could deal with the conflict and resolve the conflict. Wonderful. Camp David Accords. He gets up in front of the whole. This is one of these big auditoriums, 1,000 students. Peace in our time. We're going to have peace in the Middle East. President Clinton, Barack and Arafat. Little me, I raised my hand in this huge auditorium. And I said, Professor, according to everything you just taught us all semester, I can tell you right now it's going to fail. And he's like, he was in shock. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, because you just spent all semester teaching us the importance of understanding culture. And here, once again, there is no understanding of culture. It's the Xth time that the Western world is imposing a Western peace process without any understanding of the Middle East, Middle Eastern cultures, difference between Jews and Muslims and the Arab world. It's going to fail like everything else. Every other plan failed. He screamed at me in front of the whole auditorium. And then a week later, it failed, right? Yeah. I didn't get an apology from the professor in front of the course, but again, that was like the understanding I already had, and hence was against the Oslo Accords. Understanding was a disaster, etc., etc. But how did you go from that understanding and seeing the data and the empirical evidence to then jumping to want to investigate the whole right of return and do all your research on UNRWA and expose UNRWA for what it is?
So once I understood, what happened is that I began to understand that the key element through which you can really know that the Palestinians remain committed to from the river to the sea is this idea of return. And that remains, to the present, the best litmus test. Because especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Palestinians became more and more sophisticated in using language that appeals to Western ears.
Right.
So, for example, they would say 2 states, which they did. And we assumed that one of the two is the Jewish state. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, crazy assumption, we had to check. Or they would say things like Palestinian rights. And you think Palestinian rights, sure, they should have, but they only mean one right in particular, what they call the right of return. Or they would say justice. This is why it's called Students for Justice in Palestine, not Students for Palestinian State, which is a clear, achievable, measurable goal. Or a just solution. You hear that language. So you think justice? For sure. Justice, they should have a state. Well, great. When they say justice, they mean one kind of justice only. The justice that undoes the injustice in their view, which is the very creation of the state of Israel. So as I became more and more aware of this language and how they use it, I realized that the one thing where is really solid territory, where I can really know what they mean, is this idea of the right of return and perpetual refugeehood. And I realized also that this is the area where you have the biggest gap, because this is where Israelis and Westerners assume it's a negotiating position, it's a delusion, it's all that. And I realized from conversations that they're super serious. And that was kind of like, oh, they mean it. They mean it. It's not a negotiating position. And again, I'm saying, if people tell me, okay, in the 90s, we thought it was a negotiating position. I'm like, you know what? Legitimate to make the assumption that in the 90s, it was a negotiating position. But by now, we know that our assumption that when given the choice to have a fully sovereign state, they will negotiate away this idea of return and perpetual refugeehood for a state, we now, again, have at least two empirical proofs, Gaza is a third, that actually no, they will negotiate away a state in order to keep fighting for return and perpetual refugeehood. So I zeroed in on that because I realized that this is the one thing where they can't lie, they can't fudge, where you really know what the conflict is really about. And UNRWA, I realized, is the entire way in which the West continues to feed that ideology. So I realized that in many ways, UNRWA, despite appearing like a marginal issue, actually is at the fulcrum of everything that the conflict is about. And that's why I decided to devote so much to researching and writing about it and advocating against it.
Like, so can you expand upon that specific point? Like, why is UNRWA the focal point? How so?
Okay. So a bit of history, if I may.
Please.
When Israel is established, there's nothing unique in the fact that in the process of empires disappearing, states and nation states appearing to replace them, borders being created, typically in war and conflict, there is literally nothing unique about that and about people becoming refugees in that process.
Right.
Broadly, this is the 20th century. The 20th century begins when much of the world is divided between empires, and it ends when much of the world is divided between states. When they're lucky, they're nation states, self-determined. When they're unlucky, a receding empire drew some lines through three ethnic groups together and told them you're a state.
Right.
Okay. That's the 20th century. Tens of millions of people become refugees in the process of the transition from empires to states. Not unique. Because this is the transition in the arc of the 20th century, the message that these tens of millions of refugees get is basically this. It's tragic, it's sad, but move on. Really. Wherever you are is where you're going to stay. 14 million, 7 million Hindus, 7 million Muslims. This is where you stay. Maybe you go find protection in a third country, but basically there's no going back. And it's understood that there's no going back because going back will merely refuel the wars that created the situation. One group is exempt. So there's absolutely nothing unique about Israel being formed and many other countries in the course of war when empires are gone. The Ottoman Empire finally gone after the end of the mandates. Refugees being created. And what is unique in the case of the Arab refugees from the war is, maybe I'll add one more thing that is unique in the war itself. The war, of course, was not necessary if you look by objective demographic measures, land measures, or even political measures. The Jews and the Arabs were both offered self-determination in the land.
Right.
So there was the option of saying yes.
Right.
You know, to this day, sometimes people tell me, what options do the Palestinians or the Arabs have? I was like, they do have the option of saying yes.
Right.
So there was the option of saying yes, living side by side with a Jewish state in peace and prosperity, celebrating 76 years of peaceful coexistence. But as the Arabs themselves said, true to Bevin's analysis, they went to war because it was more important for them that the Jewish state will not emerge than to establish another Arab state. So they go to war. I call it an unnecessary war. To them, necessary from their worldview, but I will say an unnecessary war. They fail to achieve their objective. The Jewish state emerges. The price of that failure is it's a long war, very brutal. Hundreds of thousands of people become refugees, Jews and Arabs. The areas, of course, conquered to the Arabs have not a single Jew left in them. They're very effective ethnic cleansers. Many Arabs become refugees from the Jewish side. Many remain, become Israel's Arab citizens. And here is where the story splits with the rest of the world. Whereas the rest of the world's refugees got the message of it's tough, it's tragic, move on. The Arab refugees, still not called Palestinians, are basically salvaged to say, no, you don't need to move on. You don't need to accept that you failed to prevent the creation of a Jewish state. It's not that you lost, your victory is merely delayed. And at the original sin of that terrible message sits UNRWA. Now, I'll explain.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to give, I don't know if you're going to say this, but for people who do not understand the context, because two separate organizations were brought to exist to take care of refugees in the world.
So I'll explain.
Right? I don't know specifically for the Arabs. Right.
Exactly. So at the same time, it's actually not special that a temporary agency is established to settle the Arab refugees. The reason is that the biggest refugee crisis broadly is still in Europe. So the idea is, okay, for other places, we'll establish a temporary agency. There's one in Korea. There's one here in the Middle East. By the way, was established for the Jewish and Arab refugees, but Israel absorbs the Jewish refugees, and there's no need. So there's nothing special, and this agency was created for 18 months. Now, in order to tell the story of UNRWA, I tell the story of UNCRA, the case for Korea, because you don't always have alternative histories, but sometimes you do, and they're great. UNCRA operates at the same time. 3.1 million Korean refugees. That's more than 4 times the number of the Arab refugees. They are all settled by UNCRA in 4 years with a third of UNRWA's budget. No one goes home. They're all in South Korea. And UNCRA closes because it was a temporary agency to settle the Korean refugees with the message of tough, tragic, move on. Hugely successful, and South Korea, look at it, has some problems, but that, broadly speaking, a great country. This could have been the Arab world. UNRWA was created to settle the 700,000 Arab refugees in 18 months. If 3.1 million Korean refugees were settled in 3-4 years, 1.5 years for 700,000 was entirely reasonable. What the Arabs do, and this is a very important cautionary tale for the present, because there were grand American ideas to settle the refugees. People who worked on the New Deal came here. A lot of money was allocated by the US, by Britain, to build grand projects to give the Arabs a new life. But what they do is they play the long game. And again, cautionary tale for all the grand ideas at the moment. So what they were able to do is the following. They took over, they hijacked this temporary agency, and they did several things.
Who's the they?
the Arabs, including the Arab refugees themselves, but the Arab states using their power in the UN. But also their power, oil is becoming important, the Cold War, their power vis-a-vis the US and the UK. So they do several things. First of all, like you mentioned, at the same time that UNRWA is established, the actual agency to deal with refugees in the world is established. It's called the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees is tasked with implementing the Refugee Convention. Now, the Refugee Convention basically says that you end your refugee status individually in one of three equally legitimate ways.
Right.
You go home, that's great if you can. But if not, the UNHCR doesn't sit for 75 years saying, absolutely not, we're going to be here until there's return. No, they either help you settle in place or maybe get the protection of a third country, and that's it. And they try to get you out of their roster as soon as possible. That's considered success. Now, the Arabs understood very well that if the Arab refugees from the war would be treated according to the emerging international standard of the Refugee Convention, within a few years there will be no Arab refugees.
Right.
And the Arab refugees were considered, they were increasingly considered by the Arab countries and by the Arab refugees themselves as the way to keep the war against the Jewish state alive. This is also, by the way, why all the Arab countries refused to sign peace agreement with Israel in 1949. People call them the pre-1967 borders. But they were not borders because borders require an agreement. But the Arab countries actually made it clear that these are not borders.
Right.
They said it because they expect to continue.
Right.
And it's amazing, apropos, that we have this notion that Arabs will attack Israel, and if they fail, they get to go to the position from which they were attacked.
Right, right.
And the
Same as the negotiating positions
exactly.
as well.
In the lines that were the lines that they said
Right.
are only ceasefire lines because the war continues, suddenly become consecrated when in 1967 they fail their second effort
Right.
to undo the Jewish state. Anyway, they realized that if the Arab refugees would be treated according to the international standards, there would be no Arab refugees. So they secure an exemption. And the exemption loophole looks like this. It says that the UNHCR will treat all refugees in the world except those who are treated by another agency. And then what they made sure is that UNRWA would never close, but that it would never settle anyone. And that's how they hijacked it. And what happened is that they also threatened the US and the UK who wanted to close down UNRWA. Just in case anyone's wondering, in real time, it was clear that UNRWA is a failure. It's not settling a single Arab refugee. The Arab countries were very sophisticated about taking the money from the US, but not doing what the US and the UK wanted, which was to settle the refugees. Again, a cautionary tale for today. Notice, again, they will try, you have the Trump plan and all that, they will try to take for themselves, but make sure that nothing is done.
Right.
Knowing that ultimately there's a time year of 4 years, they just need to wait it out. That's what they did. They basically made sure that UNRWA never closed. So you have this loophole where UNRWA doesn't have to operate according to international standards. It could inflate the number of refugees multiple times. It provides services, ongoing services. It's entirely taken over by the Arab refugees themselves, now called Palestinians, in no small part because of UNRWA. And it's paid for by the West.
Right.
So UNRWA becomes the womb in which a very particular type of Palestinian nationalism is born, which is entirely focused on return and revenge and on negation. It does not seek something positive like statehood or self-determination. It seeks, like Bevan said, the non-existence of a Jewish state. And what unites Arab refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, under the UNRWA school system becomes this nationalism that is focused on negating the Jewish state. And this is how to understand Gaza. 70% of Gaza's inhabitants are registered by UNRWA as Palestine refugees, told generation after generation that Gaza is not their home, that even though they were born there and their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents, their real home, the one they need to take back, in their view, is from the river to the sea. And when people over the years thought that return is just some benign nostalgia, I always said no, because you could see it in the Arab text, very violent. They describe return as tear out their hearts from their bodies, their fingernails from their limbs. But on October 7th, we saw it. On October 7th, you saw euphoria across the Palestinian world and their collaborators. And the reason was not that they were escaping some open-air prison. We know it. We always knew it wasn't true. Now the world saw that it wasn't true. They were elated and exhilarated because they were groomed for 74 years to that day for the idea of return. And what they saw on October 7th was the realization of return.
Wow. So, first of all, this information is so important, and thank you so much. Also with the history. I'm a history buff personally, and I'm very much pro people hearing as much of the details to really get a bigger picture and an understanding of everything, and this is so important. So, I want to ask you this question. And this is, again, coming from me, right-wing, pro-Jewish resettler, right? I live in Judea and Samaria, in the Judean hills, someone who protesting against Oslo, understanding the two-state solution was a delusion and would just push peace further away, not bring peace. What is your position now regarding the two-state solution? And again, I'm someone that for years has talked about, no, the need to move, the way to move forward is really for Israel, the Jewish people, to have sovereignty in Judea and Samaria and Gaza and everything that brings, and working out the details. But what do you say today regarding the two-state solution that you were very much a part of and believed in the euphoria back in the 1990s?
Before I ask, in your vision, before I answer, in your vision of annexation, what happens to the Arabs of the West Bank?
Everyone who wants to kill us is either in jail because they're trying to kill us, or killed because they're trying to kill us, or not living here. They live somewhere else. And everyone who understands how blessed they are to live in the Jewish state of Israel, as Israeli Arab Muslims are blessed to live, they get to have residency status living in Judea and Samaria.
But not
Gaza.
citizenship.
Not citizenship.
Got it. Okay, so my view remains the following. Between the river to the sea, the ultimate vision is one of equality. The people have, in my view, the right to govern themselves. That remains. But for me, the understanding now is that what stands between us and any vision of equality is the ideology that by now has become the identity. I've come to call it Palestinianism. Palestinianism is the ideology that has 4 core tenets. From the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are perpetual refugees until return. That's basically the ideology. So my argument is I'm actually agnostic on the political arrangements. Meaning what? I don't think the political arrangements were essentially ever the issue. Yes, a state, not a state. My colleague Mordechai Kedar offers 7 emirates. People say Jordan and Egypt should annex them back. I'm saying all of these things, in my view, are the political arrangements that even begin to become possible once you address the core issue. Now, the core issue being that the Arabs are organized around the idea of no Jewish state. And that has to change. And how does it change? A variety of ways, but first and foremost, you begin to remove the fuel. UNRWA is such a major source of fuel. You begin to remove the fuel. Again, if I'm going to the present moment, a lot of people are looking at the Trump plan and they immediately imagining it being implemented and the Arabs, let's say, of Gaza being gone. I'm knowing that the Arabs have a long and, from their perspective, a successful history of playing the long game taking what they can
Right.
and not what they don't. I'm saying we need to do the same. In retrospect, for example, we wasted the decade between the end of history and 9/11, the fall of the Soviet Union and 9/11, we wasted it on direct negotiations rather than at chipping away at Palestinianism, so that perhaps in the future negotiations could be successful. So for example, now, in response to the Trump plan on Gaza, a lot of Gazans and Arabs said, but Gaza is our home. Fabulous. So now can we accept that Gaza is your home? So can we, as an immediate act,
Right.
before anyone leaves or doesn't leave, can we immediately secure that none of you are refugees, so everyone needs to be erased from UNRWA's records as a refugee. There's no such thing as a right of return. Can we get an Arab League decision?
Right.
If you want to stop the Trump plan, okay, so let's get an Arab League decision that there's no right of return into the state of Israel. No one in Gaza is a Palestine refugee, and they're home. Can we at least get that? So what I'm saying is that when we are presented with geopolitical opportunities, let's try to chip away at Palestinianism. That's one side. In terms of what Israel does, over the years, despite absolutely not being a supporter of the settlement movement, I actually was a very effective person who could explain why settlements are not the reason we don't have peace.
Right.
And again, I said it's literally empirical. Arabs went to war repeatedly before there were settlements. They walked away from the Barak and Olmert proposals, which would have given them a state without settlements. Israel has proven its ruthless capability to remove settlements, made no difference. I'm like, we can empirically show that that's not the reason why we don't have peace. And I have colleagues who say from the left, they will say, Einat, okay, we get it, this is still the conflict, but we still need to leave a part for them so that they have a horizon, right? Ofik, hope. I have colleagues from the right who say, no, we need to build settlements so that they know that we're here and we're going nowhere. And I'm like, look, hate to break it to all of you, because again, by now we have decades of evidence. We build settlements, we remove settlements. We occupy territory, we disengage from territory. The impact of all of that on Palestinianism is a big fat zero. The impact on Palestinianism are things like world affairs, like an American president who's willing to turn the table, the fall of the Soviet Union, their support for Saddam Hussein. Those are the things that create opportunities. When they feel cornered, when they feel more isolated, those create opportunities, not if we build or remove settlements, give territory or conquer territory. So once you remove that from the equation, that our actions accept our sovereign existence. The one thing that is a problem is our continued sovereign existence. But beyond that, left-wing governments, right-wing governments, building settlements makes no change to Palestinianism. So then it becomes an Israeli question. What do we want to do with the territories? And here I've developed my view at the moment is I call it sovereignty before settlement. Okay. Because I believe that the biggest problem ultimately of the settlement enterprise is that it was carried out in essentially illegal no man's land. As I said, I'm no fan of annexing 32 Arab villages and calling them United Jerusalem forever and for good. But at least a person who lives in Ramat Shlomo doesn't go in the morning to burn the goats of his fellow Arab neighbor. He behaves like a normal citizen. So in my view, a lot of what the settlements have cost us is the fact that they exist in this kind of lawless no man's situation. Even if nobody recognizes the annexation of East Jerusalem, the fact that Israel annexed it and Israel treats East Jerusalem like sovereign Israeli territory already changes how people act when they live in that territory. So in the same way, I'm saying, fine, you think the West Bank should be annexed. Someone thinks it shouldn't. I'm saying take it through the Knesset. Make your case. Other people will make their case. And pass a vote in the Knesset. The Jordan Valley, 20%, 30%. But this notion of like settling without clear Israeli annexation, that in my view has to go. That I think has been the greatest disaster that has literally, in my view, like seeped, kind of really taken a lot of Israeli assets. So that's my view basically right now. So you want to make your case. In general, I say that I want to bring back the lost art of persuasion. Both, I think, on the Israeli left, there's a very problematic notion of hoping to be saved by the outside. You know, we'll get like Western powers or outside NGOs to tell us what to do.
Right.
And I'm like, no, if we think we have the winning idea, we need to persuade Israelis. Telling Israelis that they don't understand and that they're stupid has never been a winning strategy for winning elections. But the same for the right. I think the right, this whole like working underneath, using Jewish organizations, taking a job in the Ministry of Defense to kind of under the radar take budgets and like hid them and send them to the settlements. I think that's a disaster too. You think that Israel should annex all, some, part, make your case, get it through a vote. But if it's not voted, it's not happening.
No. Listen, I'm not... I want to go to a deeper issue, so I don't want to go deep here in terms of arguing, in terms of us resettling Judea and Samaria. One thing I can... So I disagree with a lot of what you said, but one thing I can agree with you, the problems with government and the problems that is now since 1967 that consecutive Israeli governments since then have never seriously making the decisions necessary in order that our presence in Judea and Samaria be as proper as it should under the law and not under a military occupation. Jews, now not everyone knows this, Jews in Judea and Samaria, me, I'm living under a military occupation. It's not just the Arabs, but it's the Jews, right? Not everyone else understands that when they hear the word occupation. It's a legal term referring to the fact that Israel, the sovereign state of Israel, has still not firmly, legally applied total sovereignty over an area that they're in control of. And I'm 100% in agreement with you that our governments, left and right, believe me, I'm very critical of the right-wing governments over the years, that they have yet to do so. And I am hopeful that within this administration that will finally be taken care of. But the deeper issue I want to go with you, because you've done a fabulous job of really explaining for everyone, left, right, and center, the centrality of the problem of Palestinianism, and of course the centrality of UNRWA being used as a tool to develop, foster, and empower this Palestinianism to act basically as a cancer that will forever be a cancer to the Jewish state of Israel, and that's the reality. I want to take a step back, because to me, UNRWA or no UNRWA, this Palestinianism is a pawn. Not, and as you're saying it so clear yourself, it's a pawn of the Arab world for years. Meaning, UNRWA or no UNRWA, two-state, no two-state, whether it's the Shiites of the mullahs in Iran, or it's the Muslim Brotherhood of Turkey, now taking over Syria and in Egypt, they're always going to be doing something to stop us from us having a sovereign Jewish state in Israel. Hence, my perspective in all this, again, and I'm going to put my belief hat aside, just as the rational Westerner, using the empirical evidence and the reality of our situation, realpolitik is the Jewish state of Israel to survive in this region. Whether the Palestinianism will continue being the pawn at the moment or not, we have to be as big and strong as possible to deal with the reality of living in a region with, as I describe, 1,400-year ideology that includes within it Jews not being able to live in our ancestral homeland. So how and that goes beyond whether UNRWA exists or doesn't exist. Palestinian Arabs are accepted as the world or not, or they're here, or they're not in Gaza anymore. Doesn't make a difference. I'd love to hear your response to that.
Sure. So this really goes to the core issue in terms of us living here. Over the years, people find my presentation very disturbing in that I essentially put the onus on the Arabs. I say, we've always agreed to share, to divide, to two states, going back to the creation of Transjordan, as long as there's a Jewish state. The Arabs, no. And people find it very troubling. Again, that comes from this Western mindset. They'll be like, oh, two sides, extremists for both sides, and what does Israel have to do? A very senior diplomat, when he read the book many years ago, he said, you're letting Israel off the hook. And I remember thinking that that's what troubles him, which was odd. This was an American diplomat. So, and people tell me, oh, Ben Gvir, Smotrich. I'm like, I'm really not concerned. And I remember even once another European ambassador told me, those settlers, they're messianic, it's all that, you can't negotiate, it's irrational. And I said, let's look at irrationality, because he said, it's biblical land. I was like, okay, is there biblical land in the Sinai? Like, yeah. Biblical land in Lebanon and Syria? Yeah. In Jordan, Transjordan? Yeah. Biblical land in areas A and B? Yes. I was like, look at the irrational settlers. They seem to only live where the IDF protects them. So it's not so irrational at the end of the day, because I say that there are two incontrovertible facts of our existence here. First, as long as the Jews want to be sovereign, and sovereignty is only in the land of Israel, over the years, as I would teach what a Jewish state is, I would go through the history, empires, nation states, people would say, okay, we get it. The Jews are a people. You have the right to self-determination. Why here? I'd be like, anywhere else is exile. Like, as individually, Jews can live well in other places. Absolutely. But sovereignty, collectively, we're only connected to one land and one land only. In the coming and going, but we're connected to one land and one land only. So sovereignty is here. Now, given, as you said, that the 7th century conquests by the Arab and Muslim world have been a huge success, well done on them, this means that as long as the Jews want to be sovereign, and sovereignty is only in the land of Israel, we are destined or damned, choose your word, to remain an ethnic, linguistic, national, religious minority in an Arab and Islamic region. There's no getting out of that.
Right.
I always like to tell people in 1948, when Ben Gurion declares independence, the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region is 1 to 50, 50. Ben Gurion, keenly aware of our situation, you said being strong and big, asks Jews to immigrate, make aliyah. Great, more than 3 million Jews come in Israel's existence. He tells women to have babies. Wonderful. Israel, as I'm sure you know, is has the most babies for a country of its wealth. Great. We are more than 10 times the Jews we were in 1948, and the ratio of us to the Arab world is 1 to 60, which I say they've been busy too. So I like to say that there's no amount of immigration or procreation that gets us out of our minority status in the region.
Correct.
So this is the number one incontrovertible fact. Right. That's it. Number two, I used to say there's no God. It got me into theological arguments. So now I just say God is not a working plan. And it turns out that a lot of religious people feel more comfortable with that, so fine. The idea that essentially God is not a working plan. God is not going to magically arrange for 2 billion Muslims to disappear or for 500 million Arabs to go. So given those two incontrovertible facts, the Jews are destined or damned to remain a minority in an Arab and Islamic Middle East, and God is not a working plan. I'm not concerned about our side. But I'm also under no illusions that we can ever become big and strong that would in any way change those. We need to be strong in order to repel, but it doesn't change. That asymmetry will remain for as long as there are Arabs and Jews. So now, for me, the vision that I put forward, and that's where your words, you said always, forever. So those are the words that I avoid. And what I say is that Israel's guiding star, North Star vision, should be to constantly pursue peace based on a vision of Arab Zionism. And you're right, getting rid of Palestinianism as an ideology is a key part of that. What does it mean? It means that ultimately all systems of thought are systems of interpretation. I taught a course a few years ago at Georgetown on Zionism and anti-Zionism. If anyone's interested, it's now a series of 5 YouTube videos online. And what I showed there is that every thought system could be integrated into Zionism and into anti-Zionism, meaning the idea of a nation state was used for assimilation and emancipation and for Zionism. The idea of socialism was used for labor Zionism, but also for communism and the Bund. The idea of Jewish theology. There's Jewish theology that is Zionist, and there's Jewish theology that is anti-Zionist. The same with Christianity. Christianity went through a process in the 17th century that ultimately created a branch of Christianity that is in many ways our rock, right? Christian Zionism. Without that, there's no British support in the beginning. There's no American support at the moment. And because ultimately all systems, religions and ideologies are human-made systems of interpretation, then I believe that the Arab identity and the Muslim identity are also capable of having a Zionist interpretation. And although it lingers at the margins right now, it is beginning to exist. And for me, that's the only way forward. And the reason also is, I don't care when people hear me saying that they say never. I say, look, never is a long time.
Never
is a long time.
With regards to what?
Arab Zionism, Palestinian.
Oh, that will never.
Will never happen.
Okay.
I'm like, look, never is a long time. And the question is, are we constantly going in that direction? Because ultimately we're locked into a zero sum, which again, Bevan very accurately, and you're expanding it to the region, very accurately noted. And the thing is this, if we're not pushing the Arabs to be Zionists, then they're pushing us to be annihilated. There's no middle ground. So I think even if you don't necessarily think it's going to happen, and I very much like the Pirkei Avot, you know, I will not finish the job. It doesn't mean that I'm exempt from doing it. This is where we need to constantly push. And I actually think I'm in the process of writing a short book that will be called Peace Not Now. And good name, right? Yeah, and the idea
especially from your background.
Exactly. And the idea is to say, look, all these times when we tried shortcuts, direct negotiations, disengaging, they've only dug us deeper into the hole. So I'm actually saying, let's now take the long term and say, this is our vision. Our vision is one of Arab Zionism. And this is our North Star every day. It means that we talk to Egypt. And we've adopted still, unfortunately, a shtetl attitude that still believes that ultimately here we're at the mercy of others, we're temporary. I remember Netanyahu a few years ago said in a Bible study group that his biggest ambition is that Israel will survive more than the Hashmonean dynasty, so more than 120 years. And the French have a wonderful phrase to describe being at home. It says, chez nous, meaning we are at ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think we have failed to convey that we are in ourselves, at ourselves. And we are so scared of kind of poking the bear and that they will notice that we're here. And even though Egypt is undermining pretty much every element of the peace treaty, we're still calling it peace because we're so afraid. Rather than telling them, I say that we need these days yekes with a Mizrahi sense of honor, meaning we have to have our sense of honor and we have to be yekes, meaning We have to come to Egypt every morning and say, this is what the peace agreements say. What are you teaching your children? What's in the books? But no, we're like, shh.
Right, for those who don't understand, Einat is referring to two different Jewish ethnic personalities, those from Eastern Europe and those from the Middle East. Like we need like the Jewish attitude that includes two aspects of each other.
Exactly.
Right.
So for me, that's the thing. Like if we're not constantly, and I think this would have made the situation in Gaza very different, because before October 7th, I went around the world with my co-writer, Adi Schwartz, and we would go to various European parliaments and tell them, don't give $1 into Gaza, because the people of Gaza believe from the river to the sea, right? 2/3 are Palestine refugees, so don't give them. Like someone recently retweeted something that I wrote in 2018, that I said, as long as the people of Gaza believe that Gaza is not their home and it's from the river to the sea, every dollar, every bag of cement will be used to build tunnels to take back what they believe is their home. So someone recently retweeted that because it's from 2018, and I said it then. So imagine that we would have constantly pushed. Doesn't mean going to war, doesn't mean bombing anyone, but you constantly push. Make it Israel's top diplomatic priority. Why are you funding? Why are they still refugees? No one in Gaza is a refugee. Why in the West Bank do you have neighborhoods called refugee camps? Why when the Pope or Prince William visits Palestine, that's what it says on their itinerary, why is the first place they're taken is a refugee camp in Palestine? Like constantly push. If we had taken seriously that the Palestinian vision of return is a working plan rather than some delusion, we would have realized that this is what they're building and not thought that we could bribe them away from their ideology. I often say that Adi and I are most proud in the book that it gives the Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word.
Right.
Because to their credit on this issue, they don't lie. So for me, if we had constantly pushed based on this North Star of we expect you to be Zionists, which literally just means embracing the Jewish right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland, then we can make any political arrangement. That's, as I said, I'm agnostic. But that's what we need to constantly push on. And we haven't done that. And this is why I believe this should be Israel's guiding North Star vision every day.
So obviously, in terms of pushing back and not standing up for ourselves, that should have never been, it's not even a right-left issue. It's something consecutive left, right-wing governments have not done properly. And that I totally agree with you. I think it's fascinating. First of all, having a fascinating conversation with you. Thank you so much. Very much enjoying it. In terms of the Arab Zionism point,
yes,
I want to surprise you and then take you in a different direction.
Sure.
Okay? Surprise you, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think that if there was a respect in the Arab Muslim world, and I believe, and this I'm as being a student of Dr. Kedar, I take from him, the only way to survive in an Arab Muslim Middle East and to have long-term peace is to have our Arab Muslim enemies fearful of ever lifting a pinky against us. So part of that Arab Zionism is by them respecting us. Part of that respect is fear, but respecting us. Mm-hmm. And we're not there yet because we don't yet respect ourselves and standing up for ourselves. Where's the difference? So that I agree. The different direction I want to take, actually, I want to bring in current events. Current events. I mean, I just made a video yesterday or within the past few days, a Pulse of Israel episode, and I used a video clip of a Lebanese. I don't know if he's Muslim or Christian. I have no clue. He doesn't say so himself. And he starts delineating. Lebanon is, and this he was made. I think he made it back in October or November. Right, so it was in the middle of the massive IDF offensive in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. Right, and he's saying, everyone around me here in Lebanon, you're screaming, get Israel out. We don't want Israel. We don't want Lebanon to be Israel. Get Israel out. Get Israel. And then he starts saying, well, this is my life living in Lebanon right now under Hezbollah. This is bad. 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 I want Lebanon to be Israel. That's a Lebanese citizen saying in the middle of war, right? And then on the other hand, we have the Syrian offensive, with, again, the ISIS, Taliban, rebels supported by Turkey taking over and overthrowing the Assad regime in like 4 days, which, again, Assad regime was horrible, so no one's wishing him back, but having ISIS, Al-Qaeda in its place does not mean the world's any better. And then you have Druze villages, I believe it was unanimous, however many villages there were, call internationally saying, we want Israel to remain. So the point I'm trying to get to is Arab Zionism will come when we understand our power living in the, not power, part of our purpose and blessing that we have in living in the Middle East is able to give the peace and prosperity for all minorities who know that under majority of the brutal Arab Muslim regimes that exist, they're seriously afraid for their lives on a daily basis. Forget about women's rights, forget about gay rights, forget all that stuff, just on their lives. And that Israel, if the bigger and stronger that we are, it's not just about being able to protect ourselves in our own little shtetl of the Jewish state of Israel. And again, I'm not going into any political things or what's going to be going on in terms of redrawing maps or whatever, but just on using empirical evidence, the knowledge that minorities close to us understand that their lives are only safe and their families' lives are only safe if they can rely on the Jewish state of Israel providing protection from them. That is what I believe is the true direction for Arab Zionism. Because then you have a respect in the Arab Muslim world. Oh my God, yeah, whoever lives under the Jews, peace, prosperity, safety, they don't even care about equality. They just want to live. Jews didn't ask, give us citizen right. No, we just want to live. And then that's a respect of the Jews, like, okay, they're here, they're not going anywhere, they're protecting others who we used to persecute. And then there's that fear of, okay, we can't lift a finger against the Jews. And hence, it's not about talking to the Arabs. Like, no peace agreements are all pieces of paper that end up getting ripped up anyway. Egypt isn't, no peace with Egypt, even though there's a piece of air. So it's not about developing the Arab Zionism through talking, but it's through acting, just being the best Jewish state of Israel we can, because we're not interested in war, we're not interested in fighting, we're not interested in sending our kids to the army. I have 2 serving the army right now, one in regular service, one in reserves, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria. They've done it all. I've been in reserves, going back in July, called up again. We prefer not to, but we understand the reality. So long as our enemies want to continue killing us, you better believe I'm going to take up that gun and proudly send my kids out to the front line to be able to defend the Jewish people, the Jewish state of Israel, and all minorities who we're able to protect. So that's my vision of that Arab Zionism, which on that point I agree, and it will happen. It will happen. Question is how we'll get there. But again, it's wonderful having this conversation and whatever disagreement there are. But yeah. So first of all, I'd love to continue talking hours. Let's end with one final question. Okay. Because we have a lot of viewers from all over the world. And again, coming from the right and coming traditionally from the left, center left here in Israel, there are plenty of people around the world who are right now scratching their heads, even Jews in America, when they see the latest surveys coming out of Israel, where they see 80% of the Israeli population, right, center, left, religious, not religious, supporting Trump's declared plan, when it happens, how it happens, if it happens, but declared plan to relocate all Gazans, and he's clarified, permanently. And they're scratching their heads. Like, how? Okay, the right-wingers, of course they say that. But center, left, and even secular, can you help people not connected with the Jewish psyche here in Israel better understand that? And I mean, I know I've explained it and written about the moral stance of why it's a moral stance, but even why, if 80% of Israelis are saying it and understanding that it's the moral thing to do, are you able to give an explanation?
Sure. So first, to your point before, George Deek, one of our great ambassadors, he's currently the ambassador to Azerbaijan. He's Arab, he's Greek Orthodox Christian, and he said, he's one of Israel's strongest defenders, and he once said, a Middle East that has no room for Israel has no room for me. And I thought, again, it was a very beautiful way to combine Zionism with the idea of the defense and protection of minorities. But ultimately, my vision is everyone. Arab minorities, Sunni Arabs, at least a plurality of the Middle East, just like with Christian Zionism, it doesn't have to be everyone, but a plurality of the Middle East that looks at the Jewish state and not as white European settler, colonialist, crusader, which are just synonyms for foreign,
right,
and therefore let's throw them out. But no, you actually belong here, and our vision depends on you being here. You're actually a missing piece of the puzzle. You make us whole. Right. In terms of the Trump plan, what people need to understand is that this is a moment that before Trump became president, felt like we were on the verge of going back to a loop, and we still feel that. Meaning what? I talked about honor being the original sin. The entire tragedy of the conflict is indeed a tragedy of ceasefires. I talked about this repeated loop that whenever the Arabs attack Israel and they fail, they get a redo. So Israelis have reached a point where they essentially feel stuck in a loop because they're saying, we tried negotiated peace several times. We tried complete disengagement from Gaza. I was then working with Paris, who was with Sharon in government. I remember the moment that he said, no, we're getting out completely everything because they're going to have no excuse. We all underestimated their ability to make up new excuses. But,
and I was in Gush Katif, Gaza, protesting
exactly.
it.
Exactly. So we tried that. Like, it actually matters that we tried. You know, sometimes you need to go through painful parts in order to create a consensus where people said, okay, we tried. We tried this, we tried this, we tried this. We genuinely tried. And it all collapsed. And it felt that we're on the verge of going back to that. Because why did Hamas kidnap people? They kidnapped them as insurance that they will commit October 7th and remain to govern and will not pay a price. And everything that happened in the Gaza Strip so far, it's important to note, is not a price from the perspective of Hamas. If they end this entire process, when they are in charge, the billions continue to flow in the name of reconstruction, then as far as they're concerned, the entire arc has been hugely successful, and they are back to getting a redo.
Right.
Now, what Trump introduced, and for most Israelis, it doesn't actually matter what are the details. What Trump introduced or reintroduced, you could say, is the quaint notion of consequences, which was completely absent from the conflict for decades.
Yep.
The idea that there are consequences for attacking. Even in Lebanon, what happened in Lebanon? Hezbollah, from Lebanese sovereign territory, starts an unprovoked attack on October 8th. Unprovoked. Because I remember people told me during those months, oh, when Israel finishes in Gaza or has a ceasefire in Gaza, then Hezbollah will stop. And I was like, excuse me? You're accepting their rationale? No. Solidarity with Gaza is not a reason for war. So it's an unprovoked attack. For 11 months, Israel goes around the world and says, hello, 1701, there's a UN resolution, everyone celebrated it. Nobody does anything, right?
Just to clarify, 1701 is the UN resolution after the last Lebanon war in 2006, and it basically said that Hezbollah is not allowed to be in southern Lebanon, not allowed to have weapons in southern Lebanon, definitely not allowed to attack Israel, and here they're totally going against that UN resolution, and the world is silent, doesn't do anything, lets them attack us for 11 months.
Exactly. And then Israel begins an effective offensive, right? What do you hear within days of Israel having a successful offensive? Ceasefire, 1701. This time it's going to be 1701, but really, really, really. So the feeling was that we're en route to having something similar in Gaza, in which no territory is taken, no one is allowed to leave. Those things used to be common. That it was understood that if one side engaged in an invasion unprovoked war, not to say an annihilationist genocidal war, they might lose territory. Their people will be displaced, right? That was Europe. I was recently in a panel in France, and it was all about, you need to go back to dialogue and the two-state solution. I felt like in the movie Back to the Future, when he's in the 50s, he kind of begins to go into all these places. So I felt I was like in some part of the world that remained kind of stuck in time. So at one point I looked at them, these are French people, and I'm going, you are all beneficiaries of ruthless leaders who at the end of World War II destroyed Germany, brought Nazi Germany to surrender, occupied it, divided it, displaced 14 million ethnic Germans. Nobody asked them if they were Nazis or not. 2 million died on the way. Really one of the most brutal acts of displacement in history. And then you could have dialogue and peace. I was like, and you're all the beneficiaries of that. So don't forget, because there's a lot of smugness often among Europeans that they have peace. And I find myself too often having to remind them how that peace actually came about. So I think for a lot of Israelis, the breath of fresh air that the Trump plan, again, regardless if it's permanent, temporary, all that, what it brings is the idea of consequences. And that takes us out of the loop of the redo, because otherwise we were literally, and we're still in danger of getting to the point where there's a redo. Right. So I think that's what you see in the support of Israelis.
Got it. Einat, thank you so much for your time. Sure. And for your knowledge. It's been a pleasure and a real enjoyment talking. And I think it's wonderful for people to be able to see the dialogue of right and left. And again, a post-October 7th reality is there aren't that many things that divide us anymore.
Agreed.
Even though there always will be, but it's really not that much.
We won't be Jewish without it.
That's right. No, but I always like, I mean, just as an aside, but it's an important aside. Whenever the issues of division come up, and they come up, and things look scary, especially before October 7th looks scary, but I always try to remind people, 90% of Jewish Israelis agree on 90% of the issues, and we can't allow the ones that make the headlines that are divisive and focus on dividing us, allow us to really be divided, because there's so much that really connects us on a day-to-day basis. So that's important. But thank you so much, Einat.
Thank you.
Right? And for anyone who has not yet purchased Einat's book, War of Return, how do they purchase it? Amazon?
Anywhere you purchase books.
Anywhere you purchase books. Google Einat Wilf, War of Return. Highly, highly recommend purchasing and reading the book. Signing off for another episode of The Pulse of Israel. Thank you everyone for watching here in our eternal and ancestral homeland of Israel, in our beautiful, biblical, and yes, indivisible, even though we still have work to make sure that whatever looks divided is not, but historically it has been indivisible, and we're going to bring it all together again. Jerusalem since King David's time. Shalom everyone, and thanks for watching.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.